Hello again. How are you? This is our final topic for our criminology course, and it is over chapter 14 of the Siegel book, Public Order Crimes. What are these things? We've already looked at some stuff in the beginning of the semester, a video about these crimes. Sometimes they're referred to as crimes of vice, and also sometimes they're called victimless crimes, where the victim is also the perpetrator. We looked at a video about how pornography is defined and ought to be legislated, and also too we considered not just pornography but prostitution. In the past, and you also saw this in the video, another form of public order crime was gambling. But for some reason, Siegel does not address gambling in this chapter. Maybe because in 48 states now in the US, some form of gambling is legal. In many of those states, the state itself generates money that then is used for the public good. So perhaps the idea of gambling is no longer really considered vice or a public order crime. Nevertheless, let's talk about some of the basics behind the idea of public order crime. First, we can review some terms we discussed before, mala in se versus mala prohibita. And mala in se, you might recall, is about serious crimes, or crimes that most societies believe should be sanctioned very heavily. So things like murder, rape, robbery. In most societies, there's a traditional agreement that these are wrong and ought to be dealt with very severely. You can contrast that against mala prohibita. And these crimes, you could say, have less consensus around them as to whether or not they should be considered criminal. So what I've done is I've listed this as less serious crimes, acts that are considered crimes within a given society, because a given society says, okay, we want to prohibit these things as well. And so these are really reflecting current public opinion. And as we know, public opinion changes over time. So these laws may differ depending on, for example, the places. Like in different states in the United States, you might have different laws about things like prostitution and even things like the legalization of, say, medical marijuana. And you might have changes over different eras, and you see those things very well. The sociology of law, which we also talked about in chapter 1, is a good area to look at if you'd like to see these changes over time. The questions that are raised within this chapter, in part, are big questions. What is moral? What is moral and what is immoral? How do we decide, and who gets to decide these things? Should the basis be in religious codes? Should the basis be in terms of self-harm, which we'll talk about in a minute? And how do we determine these things? Because again, ideas about them change, and people's beliefs may even change over the course of their lifetime. So what happens is I have a list of the various ways these decisions can be made or thought about. One issue is perhaps what the majority of people in a given society or area think. So it could be majority rule. Well, 51% of the population in a particular state want to, for example, legalize marijuana, which was the case in Colorado. They wanted to legalize medical marijuana use. And so they changed the law. The majority rules. And that is a big change from the past and the idea of federal statutes which criminalize marijuana. So right now we're having some battles, federal law versus state law, and which one has jurisdiction over the use of marijuana for medical purposes. So the majority of people, that can be an important factor in deciding what should be a public order crime or not. Culture conflicts. This is an interesting consideration as well. Some cultures will promote things that other cultures find abhorrent or disagreeable. A great example might be if you were to go to parts of the Middle East, you would find that it's acceptable for adult males to marry people who in the United States might still be considered children. Males might marry girls who are the age of 12 years old. That would be considered illegal in the United States. So you could talk about culture conflicts over what is appropriate or inappropriate behavior. As I mentioned a minute ago, this notion of social harm is also crucial to consider with this. What is harmful to the community, and what is considered harmful to an individual's self? And to what extent should people be given freedom? And that may include the freedom to harm themselves. So, for example, if you were to take prostitution, you could ask, who is being harmed with this practice? To what extent is it perhaps freedom of choice of individuals' participation? To what extent does it involve some other types of criminal behavior? And how do people think about this generally? Would a majority of people be in favor of this being criminalized or decriminalized, as they say? Finally, you can consider the notion of moral crusaders. And these are individuals who are very keen on making sure that either laws are changed or certain laws are upheld. So in the United States, in the Supreme Court, we had a decision in the 1970s, Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion. And there are moral crusaders who go around to different legislative bodies and picket and try to promote the idea of making abortion illegal, and also to cutting off funding for abortion clinics and things such as this. So those people would count as moral crusaders, trying to determine what counts as law and if certain laws should be upheld or changed. Your chapter also discusses sexually related offenses, and that is the first category that they look at of public order crimes, and then after that they consider drug use. So the two big topics in this chapter. Paraphilias is a term that refers to some type of bizarre or abnormal sexual practices, and there are three different foci for these. Sexual practices that are focused on things like non-human objects, so for example, bestiality, sex with animals. Another type would be humiliation, and that would be sadomasochism as an example of that. The third form of paraphilias is sexual focus on children, commonly known as pedophilia. Prostitution is an issue that concerns many societies, whether or not it's legalized, whether or not it's been criminalized, or whether or not certain law enforcement agencies look the other way. And you might again remember we saw some material on this in the first video that you watched in the first part of this semester. So prostitution, in a very, very simple way, is paying for sex. And its definition in your textbook, non-marital sexual access. There's also been studies of types of prostitutes. So that's part of these last few chapters that we look at typologies and ways of trying to understand different types of participation in certain crimes in order to maybe enact policy to address, to better address these types of crimes, and also to use our scarce resources in ways that are more effective, right? And so, let's walk through some of these briefly. Streetwalkers are prostitutes who are publicly very visible, as the name implies, working on streets. And one of the big problems with this type of crime and these perpetrators, they're very vulnerable to victimization, to attacks, to robbery, and to murder. Your text mentions bar girls, and this is a different category where individuals, prostitutes, are colluding or working with the owners of bars to get patrons to buy them higher priced drinks. And then what happens is the bar girl may get a watered down version of the drink. And so there's basically fraud that's happening in this context. Brothel prostitutes are women who work in a controlled setting called a brothel that's run by a madam. And in the United States, these are legal only in rural Nevada. There's a mistake most people make. They believe that brothels are legal in Nevada generally, but that's not the case. They're not legal in larger cities, only particular counties where they have said this is something we can benefit from because they also generate taxes for those counties. So not something across the board in that state. Call girls have defined here prostitution that's arranged through some kind of electronic medium. It may be through telephones, it may be through the internet, and it may involve what are called escort services. And an escort service would be some business that presents itself as providing companionship, which is an open-ended definition, but in fact is actually screened for prostitution. Circuit travelers, they talk about in your textbook as prostitutes who travel in groups, maybe to an area which has a male-dominated employment. So, for example, a logging camp, something like this. The term skeezers is also in your textbook, and this is referring to women who barter sex for drugs, and that's a particular type of prostitution that they mention. Finally, massage parlors. These can also, in a way, not unlike escort services, massage parlors can be a cover for prostitution rings. There is a question, and the question of how should prostitution be controlled? That was asked earlier in the semester in that video, Crime and Punishment Made in America. And the police officer, I think he was actually in charge of a police department, one of the fellows who was interviewed, believed that it was a waste of public resources to try to control this. And so this is an open question about how should prostitution be dealt with and who ought to be targeted. You could target many different points along the transaction. One would be the prostitutes themselves, the providers of the service. Another group you could target would be the people who are managing, or some would say exploiting and controlling prostitutes, that might help cut off the people who are organizing this type of crime. Or finally, you might go after the Johns or the men who are interested in prostitutes. And there's a question about what types of penalties would work best, what types of programs would be most effective for dealing with this crime. Fines, monetary fines, would that help reduce the occurrence of this type of crime? Should incarceration be used, maybe after fines, if those fines don't work? And should there be more incarceration for, say, pimps who are, again, benefiting more, probably exploiting prostitutes more, and therefore perhaps engaged in what could be argued as more socially harmful activities? Perhaps education is a useful way of addressing this. Perhaps educating prostitutes and Johns about the risks that they're taking when engaged in these practices, including sexually transmitted diseases, as one possible outcome of prostitution. And then also, some communities decide they want to shame the people who are involved in this, so they might publish the names of those people who have been convicted of either prostitution or Johns who are convicted of solicitation. There's this question that some people raise: should prostitution be legalized? And I mentioned a slide ago that in some rural counties in Nevada, they have decided to legalize this, in part because it helps those counties generate tax revenue. And that's one big argument that some have made for this. You are taking it out of the realm of criminal, which means you can both tax it and regulate its occurrence. You can say where it's going to happen, during what hours, and make it so that, for example, medical personnel are also involved to make sure that those people who are working as prostitutes are still able to remain healthy. Pornography. This is a whole other topic, also falling though under the idea of sex and sex-related crimes. The issue with pornography, it's the depiction of sexual acts and images through either printed material or electronically, through an electronic medium. So it could be the internet, through the telephone, these types of mediums. And the big question with pornography is our First Amendment right, First Amendment to the Constitution promotes freedom of speech, versus a notion of obscenity. And obscenity is defined, in your text it mentions from the Latin word for filth. Webster's defines it as, quote, deeply offensive to morality or decency, and it's designed to incite to lust or depravity. Your text also mentions some works that were at one point considered obscene and not allowed to be legally distributed in the United States. Works like D.H. Lawrence's book, Lady Chatterley's Lover, Henry Miller's work, The Tropic of Cancer, which later were found to have literary merit, and the obscenity label, remember we talked about labeling before, the label was something that was seen as not appropriate, that these should be protected under the First Amendment. But you also might remember from that video we saw, again, the beginning of the semester, Crime and Punishment Made in America, that community standards are involved when we talk about what counts as obscenity, and that community standards are very hard to enforce in the era of free internet access. Different people may be able to access stuff that previously in communities would have been found obscene. Child pornography. Most people are aware of this idea. People who are unable to consent to sexual acts are engaged. Those are the victims, potentially, of child pornography. And I'd like you to know about a sociologist named Philip Jenkins. He makes an argument about how we ought to address this. What's the best use of public funds, which are always finite, they're always limited. How should we address child pornography? He says that probably the most effective approach would be targeting the suppliers. There are many people who might be interested in acquiring or looking at child pornography, and you can focus your resources, your criminal justice resources on those people, but he argues that it would be more effective to go after the suppliers, a smaller number of people distributing this stuff. So again, that's part of the usefulness, I think, of considering crime typologies and typologies of criminals. The other topic dealt with in your chapter, substance abuse. And substance abuse is a fascinating issue, because there's this question of to what extent do societies tolerate drug use. For example, alcohol use in our society is tolerated by people who are over the age of 21, can buy alcohol. And also, there are problems, for example, with people who excessively use certain kinds of drugs like alcohol. You can be accused of public intoxication or public drunkenness. Also, too, certain types of drugs are, of course, illegal. And so there's a big question about how substances ought to be either legal for use or made illegal. One thing you can note is that drug use is what's called a cultural universal. All cultures have some form of substance they consider to be a drug, and they also have people using those things. So this is a category of substance that exists across all societies. The video Crime and Punishment Made in America discussed alcohol use and prohibition, the idea of the progressive movement, people wanting to basically prevent others from using alcohol. And you might recall from the video that this temperance movement I have here In the 1920s, again related to the progressives, it really didn't work. That what happened was alcohol was criminalized, but it caused underground networks of criminal organizations like the mob to become suppliers of this type of thing, which the public seemed to want. So how do you address these types of things, and what do most people consider to be, again, something that's morally repugnant or acceptable? Depends on the era, depends on the majority of people in many instances. How should we measure drug use and the availability of drugs? They're open questions. They are questions that researchers, sociologists, and criminologists are concerned about. How do you measure? What types of data can you collect on this? And we've already discussed some ideas in this semester, like, for example, self-report surveys of young people have been useful ways of considering how to get information about substance use. There are a few sources that your textbook points out for data on drug use. This first one I'm going to talk about, the United Nations Global Survey. They mention that this is really maybe not as much about drug use as it is about supplies of drugs. So it gives you information. It says the idea of like cocoa cultivation in certain countries, the production of amphetamine, stimulants, opiate production, these types of things across the globe. So that gives you an idea about different countries. If you want to look more specifically at drug use in the United States, there is a survey called the Monitoring the Future. And this really helps specifically in the United States because they're able to do yearly surveys conducted by the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan. And there are charts that show the prevalence of certain types of illicit drug use in the United States. Again, a good source of data. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health is discussed next, and this is implemented by an acronym of SAMHSA, which is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's a federal agency, a division of the Department of Health and Human Services. And so this is a national survey, and it's saying that basically drug use trends have been fairly stable over the last few years. There have been declines in the use of most illegal substances, but they've been very, very minor declines. The last source of data we'll look at here, the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, or the acronym CASA. They do a survey, and their survey is largely saying here, I'll give you a few brief ideas about it, that even though Americans are only 4% of the world's population, we consume 2/3 of the world's illegal drugs. Every American child will be offered illegal drugs before graduating from high school. Can be rather shocking to think about. It says from 1992 to 2003, the number of Americans abusing controlled prescription drugs has jumped from 7.8 to 15.1 million. In other words, more or less doubled. So there is great information that's being derived from some of these sources, and it's good to know the different ways that you can get data on drug use. Over the course of the semester, we've looked at a lot of different explanations for crime, psychological, sociological, rational choice theories, and your text goes through several of these for probably a paragraph or two each, and you can look at these on your own. To what extent do genetics influence substance abuse? To what extent is it about social learning, being exposed to drug use, and other groups validating this as something good and worth doing? So many different possible explanations for substance abuse exist, and your text goes through many different types of drug users. I'm roughly counting at least 10 different types of drug users that they talk about, with varying ways of entry into using drugs and rationales for why they do this. Finally, there's a discussion, again, policy related. How should we control drug use? How should we control the ways in which drugs are available? So this is on one particular page. There's a summary block where you'll see each control strategy that's listed here I have below, and a very brief description of how it works, the main focus. We'll go through these quickly with you. The idea of source control really is about destroying overseas crops and drug labs, so you're trying to control drugs being distributed at their source. Right? Interdiction involves the idea of the borders of countries, so you'd want to seal the borders, and you'd want to address the couriers of these substances. So this is about hardening the borders and making sure that drugs don't get in. Law enforcement talks about police doing investigating and arresting dealers. Punishment, of course, we've talked about before, the idea of deterring dealers with harsh punishment. Maybe more unfamiliar is this notion of community development. So perhaps you can help community members to deal with the presence of drugs in their neighborhoods. So this is about the communities working together and problem solving locally to figure out how to reduce drugs in a neighborhood. Drug education, teaching kids about the harmfulness of taking drugs. There's an issue we talked about before, which is the DARE program, and DARE, whether or not it's very effective. And you might recall that I mentioned that studies show that it isn't particularly effective after 6 months. So again, part of what you should consider from this course is what types of policies work and what types of policies don't. What should we fund? A few more. Treatment is dealing with already known drug users, using therapy to help them quit or stop. Increasing employment opportunities for people as an alternative to drug use has been found to be fairly effective, but it is also making sure that addicts become steady employees. Whether or not this is possible in some ways is really dependent on the addict and his or her situation. Finally, we also mentioned this before with prostitution, the question of legalization. To what extent do you want to decriminalize certain drugs or substances? For example, there's a massive debate these days, again, as I mentioned, about the legalization, or I should say maybe the decriminalization of marijuana for medical purposes. The different states are in disagreement over this and making different kinds of laws about it. The federal law still makes marijuana illegal in the United States, but then there's this question of whether or not the federal law is being enforced. And so I leave you with this issue about how we think about law and how law comes to be, what we ought to do about crime, as a way of closing in all the topics of the semester. I'd like to thank you for a good course, and I hope again you have your needs met as far as the requirements of your semester, your college career, and also two topics that I hope you'll find useful to think about throughout your life. Thanks again.